I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the coalition of the willing meets to discuss security guarantees in Paris, we hear live from Prague minutes after the speech of NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Then we assess in greater detail the attendance of other world leaders alongside Putin and Xi in Beijing. Who are they, and what do their motives tell us about the new axis of upheaval?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 4th of September, 3 years and 194 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, live in Prague, and our former Russia correspondent, James Kilner. But first, the major military and political updates of the last 24 hours. The most significant event of the week so far is undoubtedly the summit and parade in Beijing attended by Putin, Kim Jong-un and many other world leaders, seen as part of this new axis of upheaval. And later on, James Kilner is going to unpack its significance in greater detail, including looking at the other countries represented there. There is another important diplomatic meeting today, a high-level one of the so-called Coalition of the Willing in Paris, where participating nations are expected to discuss security guarantees. President Zelensky arrived there last night, and it will be co-chaired by French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Ahead of the talks, Zelensky held a bilateral meeting with Macron. The two leaders spoke at a joint press conference, during which Macron reaffirmed Europe's commitments. "We are ready," he said, "to provide political support for these agreements," referring, of course, to the security guarantees that could be formalised once a peace agreement is reached. At least that's the logic. Zelensky thanked France for its continued backing, underscoring Europe's desire for peace. Yet, he said, Russia is not showing any signals that it wants to end the war. "I am confident that our alliance with Europe and the US will help us increase pressure on Russia to move toward a diplomatic solution to this complex issue," he added, which is so important for peace. Now that comes as Putin doubled down on his claim he'd never ruled out meeting Zelensky, saying such a meeting could take place if it's well prepared and will lead to positive possible results. "If Zelensky is ready, let him come to Moscow," he told journalists in Beijing. Now, President Trump, who was meeting with the Polish president yesterday, was pushed again last night on whether he would act given Russia's continued bombardments on civilian targets. He said, "I'll speak with Putin in days and know what's next. We've taken strong action. Last week, 7,819 Russians and Ukrainians were killed, souls with parents who will never see them again. It's a stupid war. I want it stopped. We cut the money. Now we send weapons only to NATO. Putin knows where I stand. He'll decide one way or the other. If we're happy, fine. If we're unhappy, you'll see things happen. I hit India, Russia's top buyer after China, with secondary sanctions, costing Russia hundreds of billions. That's action. Phase 2 and 3 still to come. I warned, if India buys, they'll have big problems." Now, before this summit in Paris, Zelensky was in Denmark to meet Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and leaders from Nordic and Baltic countries. There, he said he plans to speak soon with Trump about increasing sanctions pressure on Russia, adding Trump had promised to respond in a few weeks. Now, I want to thank Michael in Sweden, who reminded me of an article I wrote on Christmas Eve. Sorry again, Mum. Which just underscores how predictable this all was. It said, "Despite over a year of warnings that a Trump presidency was a real possibility, Europe has failed to craft a robust independent strategy in 2024 less reliant on the US. Now Europe's fate and that of Ukraine remains tied to the goodwill of an ally that may soon prove unreliable. Its leaders hope Russia will meaningfully come to the negotiating table in 2025. What no one seems to be asking is, what if they don't? Given the battlefield dynamics and Moscow's objectives, many convincingly argue that Putin will continue waging war for as long as his economy allows him to. The Kremlin may posture as conciliatory, claiming openness to meaningful talks, but what if its proposals are unacceptable to Ukraine and its allies? This is a crucial question that seems to be almost entirely ignored in Europe. For America, the choice might be easy: pull out. Even if talks proceed, the outcomes could be bleak indeed. Russia might refuse negotiations outright, leaving Europe unprepared to arm Ukraine independently, while Trump withholds support. Alternatively, Putin could feign good faith, dragging out negotiations while the war continues, only to then offer a terrible deal: cede territory with no meaningful security guarantees that Ukraine or Europe could possibly accept. The best case scenario is that if Russia refuses to negotiate seriously, the narrative may shift, exposing Moscow as the primary obstacle to peace in the eyes of Trump. That could be the moment Washington decides to double down on supporting Ukraine, strengthening its leverage on the battlefield and potentially compelling Moscow to negotiate in earnest. But this is the most optimistic scenario, and even it entails a longer, bloodier war. This is why it has proven so disastrous for Europe not to demonstrate its capacity, both in moral terms and military terms, to support Ukraine not only to fight, but to potentially win decisively. When you concede arguments, you ultimately end up conceding territory. That is the price of inaction, and innocent people die. Now, I quote that there to say it didn't take a rocket scientist to see where we were headed. Yet still, Europe feels itself incapable of moving assertively without the US and forcing the issue of peace talks. Now, we'll hear in a moment from Dom what NATO's Mark Rutte had to say in Prague. Meanwhile, UK Defence Secretary John Healey arrived in Kyiv yesterday for coordinating priorities for the upcoming Ukraine Defence Contact Group, scheduled for September 9th in London, and on advancing joint defence projects. A major story in Ukraine at the moment is an action taken by the country's anti-corruption agencies, which were at the centre of the political controversy several weeks ago. They've announced a suspicion of illegal enrichment against Brigadier General of the Security Service of Ukraine, Ilya Vytchuk. The SBU calls it revenge on the part of NABU and the SAPU for the fact that the Security Service of Ukraine effectively counteracts Russian interference on state bodies and exposed several employees of NABU for committing crimes. So all of this basically is a continuation of the conflict between the agencies that escalated after the move by Zelensky to strip them of their independence in July, following the SBU's detention of 2 NABU investigators on suspicion of aiding Russia. A big story in Ukraine, and we'll continue to monitor it here. But turning to end to the military realm, the attacks we reported yesterday did lead to several casualties in the hours after our broadcast. In Konstantinivka in Donetsk, 9 civilians were killed and another 7 injured in just a single day. Artillery on tower blocks and a shopping centre, plus cars and a minibus hit with drones, were the main cause of death. A drone crashed in Kharkiv, leaving no injuries, but a school in Saltivsky district saw its windows shattered from the blast. The website Spy Dossier claims a Russian Tu-160 bomber suffered a launcher mechanism failure, while another was hit by lightning and returned to base with shattered cockpit glass. Last night and into this morning, over 100 long-range attack drones were fired, the vast majority reportedly shot down, including a group of around 10 targeting Odessa, but apparently 4 people have been injured in Zaporizhia when a drone hit a busy area. In terms of Ukrainian air attacks, drones struck railway infrastructure in Russia's Rostov Oblast again, that key logistics hub, causing delays to 26 services. We now have a final tally for the Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy infrastructure over the month of August. A long list all across the country, including Sochi, Volgograd, Yertan, Afipsi, Saratove, Druzhba, Krasnodar, and many others. No wonder it's got the Russians so upset. When one looks at the list, it really underscores the regularity. Now, it was another day of relatively little movement on the front lines. Russian forces attacked in Kursk and Sumy oblasts, including northwest of Sumy city near Takhino, Verachny and northeast Yunikivka. Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces counterattacked near Andriivka and Kindrativka with some gains. A Russian mill blogger claimed Ukrainian forces unsuccessfully attempted to enter Kursk east of Yunikivka using several armoured vehicles, but this is unconfirmed. Down in Donetsk, at Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces claim to have liberated Novo-Ikinomikhny. Apologies if I mispronounced that, a long one, just east of the city, while Russian attacks continue from all angles where they have forces, as they still attempt to cut it off. It is remarkable that Pokrovsk has still not yielded. Things were really dicey there a few weeks ago, but it seems that things have stabilised to a degree. Finally, before we turn to Dom, the Ukrainian Navy destroyed a speedboat of Russia's Black Sea fleet, killing 7 Russian soldiers and injuring 4 more, according to the military. They claim, with footage, that the Russian vessel attempted to land airborne troops on the Tendra Spit, the narrow island stretching some 65 kilometres just off Ukraine's southern coast. Ukrainian forces detected the operation and struck the boat using drones. As the Kyiv Independent underscores, the naval front is certainly not quiet at the moment, something we can attest to after our recent trip on the Black Sea. On the 21st, a Russian patrol boat was destroyed. A week later, a Russian small missile ship was damaged, as was a carrier of cruise missiles near occupied Crimea. So that's where we are with the military and political updates. But let's turn now to our very own Associate Editor of Defence, dialing in live from Prague. Dom, I'm still very keen to hear about the price of a pint there, but I know you've had more important business first with Secretary-General Rutte. Over to you.
Yeah, well, hello, Francis. Hello, James. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me back on again today. So, this is day 2 of the Prague Defence Summit by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So they've released a paper to go, or a big pamphlet to go with this summit, and it's titled Progress and Shortfalls in Europe's Defence and Assessment. And that really kind of encapsulates everything that I've seen today and last night. Still haven't discovered the price of a pint, Francis, because I was having dinner in the Palace last night and I couldn't buy it. Well, they didn't do pints either. Yeah, sorry about that. But I'm going to the Red Stag later, apparently, so I'll rectify that. But yes, this is all about, well, it's mainly Europe, which includes obviously the Transatlantic Alliance. But the whole title there of this document, Progress and Shortfalls, says it all. Now, I should have been a good journalist, and I should have checked my notes from the last Prague Defence Summit and from the Lennart Meri conference I went to in Estonia, because I think I'm hearing the same thing time and time and time again, which is we need to be more agile, we need to cut through the bureaucracy with our procurement systems, we need to innovate at pace and all this kind of stuff. I think I'm hearing the same thing again and again and again, which I don't know if that's a good thing, whether or not these things have to be said over and over and over before it sort of sets into the political firmament and they do something about it, or if it's just another conference with people saying the same thing. So I'm a little bit kind of on the fence. We've had a few sessions so far. The keynote speech this morning was from Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary General. It was okay. I was a little underwhelmed. I wasn't expecting him to make any big announcements. Every time he defends the current situation and progress or lack thereof, I feel a little bit of his soul is dying. I think he must have a lot of Horcruxes somewhere just to keep him going. But for example, he said, until recently, Russia has been producing more ammunition than the whole of NATO, but we are turning the tide. It's like, turning the tide? Geez, we're 3.5 years into this bit, and we should have been seeing it for years before that. So if we're now turning the tide and producing more, starting to produce more ammunition than Russia, that doesn't speak of a huge sort of great impetus and rush to the barricades and get stuff sorted. He was asked about extending Article 5. He said not for Ukraine. He said there'd be no Article 5 for the Indo-Pacific nations either. They're represented here, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Taiwan also here, met a delegate. So no Article 5 for the Indo-Pacific. Again, wouldn't necessarily expect him to have said anything there. But he was asked about the difficult negotiation with Donald Trump. Now, as I said, I think Mark Rutte's got a really tough job. He has got to keep the alliance together in the face of some, if I'm being generous, I'd say mixed signals from Donald Trump. And if I was feeling a bit less generous, I'd say disinterest or something even worse. So Mark Rutte said of Donald, he said there are 3 things you need to know about Donald Trump. He said he's forced the increase in NATO defense spending. That is true. And I will come back to that in a minute. He said number 2, and I was thinking, number 2 is going to be something about Russia or Ukraine. Number 2, Donald Trump has taken clear action against the Houthis. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, but I'm surprised that's the second thing out of the mouth of the NATO Secretary General. And number 3, and I nearly fell off my chair when he said he's broken the deadlock on Russia. So Mark Rutte is coming out with the same things again. Perhaps he has to, it might be a little bit of performative diplomating, but nothing particularly groundbreaking. He was saying how how we've got the wherewithal, the financial and the industrial wherewithal to see down the threat from Russia, talking about the size of the economy. So, Russia's economy is just the size of Texas. Between us, we can overmatch that. And later on, he referred again, he cracked a gag. He said, blah, 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 Putin, he's the governor of Texas, which might, I'm sure Greg Abbott might be a little bit miffed at that comparison. So all in all, was it a dialed-in speech? Pretty much. It was what we expected. Didn't say anything too groundbreaking. He hasn't got the wiggle room to say anything too groundbreaking. Took a few questions and expertly sort of dodged them. But, he turned up at least. Elsewhere, again, this message of the sort of defence industrial gap was coming through loud and clear. We had comments from Paul Johnson, for example, the Swedish defence minister. He was saying, we need to wake up every morning and aggressively attack bureaucracy. Like, yeah, okay, great, but that shouldn't be news. Senator Pavel Fischer, the chair of the Czech Republic's Committee on Foreign Affairs, he said, our opponents will not be impressed with our accounting exercises. Yep, totally with you there, Pavel. But what are we going to do? Mark Sedwill, the Lord Sedwill, Britain's former National Security Advisor, Cabinet Secretary, he said European NATO nations can field as much as the US in terms of military equipment, but we are too postured for peacekeeping and we have lots of separate defence industrial considerations. He made the point that in European NATO, there are 17 main battle tanks, different variants of. The US has one. He's talking about frigates and destroyers. He said in European NATO has 29. The US has 4. That is correct. I don't know the numbers, but I believe him when he says it. But there's very good reasons for that, and not all the reasons are bad. But these points land, and I'm just left thinking, so what? So what are we going to do about it? What's happening next? Mark Sedwill said that there's no real political conversation going on with the publics over security and about how the greater need for money spent on defence and security is going to impact the social welfare model that Europe enjoys and the things they want to tackle, like climate change. We've got ageing populations, we've got low growth across Europe, high national debt. So all these things are great demands on the exchequer. So it's difficult for security and defence to cut through that. But he was saying we haven't even had the conversations with the public. Pavel Fischer said that we're suffering from having too many behind closed doors chats. He said the public is unaware of the threat facing us and therefore the option to do something about it. Of course, it's all a political choice. We could choose to rearm or we could choose to spend money on social welfare models, potholes and climate change. It is all a choice. I'm not saying it has to go on defence and security. That's my view, as you probably know. But the point they're making is the public are not being engaged on this. So never mind the scale of the problem. We're not having that public conversation. Meanwhile, Russia is at 40% spending on defence. However, Jani Kusela, who's the Director General for Defence Policy in Finland's MOD, he said they are having a very real conversation with their public. Defence spending in Finland is at 3% now, 3% of GDP. He said that is already impacting the social services that Finland enjoys. Finland, like many countries, the further north and east you go in Europe, they are high taxed, but they have great social and welfare benefits because of that. We in Britain, we want kind of US style tax and Nordic style services. Ain't going to happen. But he was saying in Finland, they are already shifting money out of those social programs into defence at 3% already. And he said the responsibility weighs heavily on me, i.e. he's got to make sure every single cent and euro is spent correctly and in line with what the public want. Again, saying the right sort of things, but some of the panelists asked if you could change one thing at the moment, what would it be? And I hear things like, we need a new strategic culture, a new way of thinking. It's like, crikey, hopefully that would have happened years ago. Remove bureaucratic hurdles, innovate at speed, anything we can do to fund and accelerate defence production. I mean, these shouldn't be new ideas. Anyway, speaking to a number of people here from the defence industrial side, I was asking, where are we in terms of, hang on just 1 second. Oh, sorry, that was just that was housekeeping, checking the minibar. It's all good. It's all good. The Pringles are secure. Don't worry. Anyway. Yeah, we're just not there on the defence industrial political mashup isn't happening yet. A senior representative from one of the defence firms didn't want to be attributed, but I was describing a sort of an arc, if you like, left of arc where we are at the moment with every country trying to do its own thing and look up and promote defence sovereignty and what have you, or right of arc if there was some Euro god who could say, right, France, you do the IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, Czech Republic, you make the artillery ammunition, Finland, you do the drones, Estonia, do cyber. That's not going to happen. And that was described to me as a kind of common agricultural policy for defence, which might be what's sort of required, although you then have all the problems that the common agricultural policy suffers with. So the dial has shifted barely from where we are now. And this industry representative was saying to me that they get a lot of demand signals from politicians and a lot of tub-thumping speeches about defence industry needs to step up and make the markets. And they say, look, demand signals don't equal contracts. And unless you put the ink on the paper, then they can't move. Then, in fact, they're not going to invest. They're not just going to wait. That's not how business works. Again, this shouldn't come as a surprise. And this individual was saying to me, even if the EU did take a much more proactive stance on defence industrial and who's going to do what, more EU involvement, because it would be led through the EU structures, I imagine, including Britain and others outside of the EU, but it would almost certainly go through that mechanism. But more EU involvement and oversight equals more bureaucracy, and that's exactly what we're trying to get away from. So it is a very difficult problem to crack. I was just somewhat disappointed that we are here, like I say, 3.5 years into the full-scale invasion, let alone the threat signals that Russia was sending before that, and we're still having these conversations. I did ask a particular question that if you were listening a few days ago, you would have heard me rehearse this question with Phillips O'Brien about Donald Trump has forced NATO to spend 5% of GDP on defence. But what is this horrific threat that demands 5%? You can't answer that without saying the word Russia. And yet all the signals from Donald Trump is that he doesn't view Russia as a threat requiring 5% of GDP. So I asked Stanley Brown. Stanley Brown is he's from the US State Department, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Political and Military Affairs. I said, if you're insisting that spending goes up to 5%, but you're not treating the threat seriously in all the other messaging that we see between the US and Russia, how can I view this push for increased spending as anything other than a Ponzi scheme to get European and Canadian taxpayer money onto the balance sheet of US defence companies? Anyway, he wasn't impressed with that. He did answer it, but he said, no, that's a mischaracterization. That's not what's happening. However, he then later on did say the US views European investment as an opportunity to revitalize the US industrial base, and then said America is open for business. So I'm not sure those two statements sit alongside each other exactly. Asked specifically about Ukraine. Now, he is from the US State Department, but to be fair to Mr. Brown, this is not his area at all. However, he did say the United States urges all parties to avoid escalation and conflict. A bit of a lukewarm response. All parties, Russia and Ukraine, and Russia's been the aggressor here, but to avoid escalation and conflict. It was fairly lukewarm. And that statement on that particular field, specifically about Ukraine, Russia, is writ large so far across this summit, which again is saying Europe needs to get its defence industrial and political link in order and start working out really what are we going to do against this resurgent threat and the changed world, not only with Russia, but also China, as I'm sure James will be talking about a little bit later. So all in all, and it's only halfway through day one, I suppose, I'm hearing a lot of the same things again, and I can't decide if that's a good thing and the message is going to finally get through to the politicians, or if I'm just hearing the same thing again and again and again. But that's it for me from Prague. I'm going back downstairs now. We're talking about deterring Russia. I'm going to be chatting to some NATO reps a little bit later. It's nice here, Prague, lovely city, as you say. In terms of any after parties, white men in suits talking about strategic dilemmas or empowering defence industrial innovation at the speed of relevance. You can tell I've read a few of these pamphlets. So the after parties here aren't brilliant, hence I'm going to head to the Red Stag. But Francis, I can't go without saying that if my after parties are dull, I hear you were at a very interesting after party last night. And that's me from Prague, wishing you all the best.
Oh, God, he's put me in it here. Yeah, through a bizarre set of circumstances, I found myself at the after party for the premiere of the new Downton Abbey film last night. Don't ask. I felt like an imposter. I've never actually watched the show. So I spent the whole night wondering if I was speaking to sort of famous actors and actresses and didn't have the foggiest who they were. But thankfully, I don't think any social faux pas were committed, although I did feel a little bit worse for wear this morning. Let's get down to business with James Kilner. That's Disney, isn't it? That's not Downton Abbey. Anyway, James, welcome back. Always a pleasure to have you on here. And it is a big week for some of the reasons that Dom has already talked about. So can you take us through, please, your reactions to the significant events in Beijing, and first of all, that military parade?
thank you very much for having me back on your podcast. So this military parade yesterday was obviously completely remarkable, and I'm sure most of your listeners have already seen all the images and the video of Chinese President Xi, Russian President Putin, and the North Korean dictator Kim leading out this cortege of leaders to watch the Chinese military parade in sort of a geopolitical tribute to Reservoir Dogs or something, very, very sinister version of. The headlines have all been written. I think it is important to sort of highlight to your listeners that behind the top three guys was a dozen or 15 other leaders, mainly from Central Asia. They've been hanging around since Sunday for this Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in northern China. SCO focuses on Central Asia, but is led by Russia and China. They had the summit strategically just ahead of this military parade. Also in attendance were several leaders from South Asia, a few from Africa, and the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan. And also, interestingly, Francis Pezeshkian, president of Iran, he was also there. Now, perhaps before Israel and the US bombed Iran a couple of months ago, he may have had a seat on the front row, or certainly near the front row, but you'd have expected him to be up there. Instead, he was like 3 or 4 rows back. The way they grade these things, it's pretty clear that the Iran angle has been downgraded. And this is important in the context in the Ukraine war, because as we know, Iran was a staunch supporter of Russia for the first year and a half, 2 years, sending all these Shahed drones across the Caspian Sea and some missiles as well. But since this short bombing campaign of Iran, we know that Iranian-Russian relations have fractured to the point where a senior Iranian advisor last week was accusing Russia of handing over coordinates of Iranian air defense systems to Israel. The downgrade of these relations was on show. This is my point, was on show in Beijing yesterday with the Iranian president lined up so far back down this cortege, even behind the Central Asian leaders. Also in attendance, Daniel Andrews. He's a former premier of Victoria region in Australia, and he was one of the few, well, maybe the only Westerner who was in attendance for the actual military parade. He's at the back row of the family photo, and it raised all sorts of questions. Digging around, it seemed that Mr. Andrews has always had a pro-China line, and he actually signed Victoria up for China's Belt and Road project, which comes with a lot of links and ties to the Chinese government. If you sign up for it, you basically get new port, new railway, new roads, etc. But you make your statehood, your independence very vulnerable, and Andrews signed up to this. Since then, he's been a sort of, I think some people would say something of a stooge for the Chinese government. Other people may say he's been an independent actor who's been promoting Chinese interests. But anyway, it's sort of an interesting side story there. There was also a UN Undersecretary for Economic Affairs watching the parade as well. So it does get a bit convoluted the further out you start looking at it. In the Russian media, this parade is played out in a fairly interesting way. You may expect them to hammer it hard about how Putin, Kim and Xi are presenting a new axis, opposing the West, etc. This was coming through a bit. And they're certainly poking fun at the Western media, saying, oh yeah, the Western media has been horrified by this new front. But that wasn't really their strongest angle. Their main angle was very much Vladimir Putin has had a hugely successful 4-day trip to China where he dominated the world stage. That was their real propaganda angle. In many ways, I would say that this trip to China was broadly a success for Putin. He loves, as we discussed so many times, to posture on the world stage, in the global spotlight, etc., lapping up all the attention. This was, something of a wet dream for him. He had the 2-day Shanghai Cooperation Organization and then 2 days of bilateral talks with China and then this military parade. This was the global spotlight magnified. I probably don't need to remind your listeners, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, although it was hosted in China this year, it's a joint Russia-China project. So he was very much at the center of the whole thing, although he wasn't officially the host. He was just behind Xi on the pecking order there. And then they had these important bilateral relations in this parade. The SCO summit was actually very consequential for Putin because he got to meet global leaders, who was able to, show that he was on the world stage talking to people, etc. Perhaps most importantly was Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, who was in China for the first time for 6 or 7 years. When Modi met Putin, Modi told Putin that India stands shoulder to shoulder with Russia, which is a real statement considering the pressure that the US has been putting India under with sanctions and tariff threats. It was almost one in the eye for the US, that statement from Modi, and a big plus for Putin. Putin also met with Robert Fico, the Slovakian leader, Alexander Vučić, a Serbian leader. These guys have been sort of more pro-Putin than any other European leaders. They went to Putin's military parade in Red Square in May, and here they were doing the same sort of thing in Beijing a few months later, and also meeting up with Putin. And Fico was particularly vocal, and he came out with this extraordinary quote. He called the EU a toad at the bottom of a well. Clunky analogy for saying that the EU can't see its vision is very blinkered, i.e. it should be more relaxed toward Russia and shouldn't be taking such a hard line on Russia. So, again, Putin doing really well there. I would say, though, there was one setback and one disappointment for Putin. The first was at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Putin was trying to push the idea of an interstate SWIFT-style monetary system, cross-border monetary system. We know that Russia's had problems pushing monetary transactions overseas since it was kicked out of SWIFT. It was using Chinese banks a lot. It was buying a lot of yuan, etc. But this has been impacted by US sanctions on Chinese banks. So Putin was again talking up this idea of an interstate SWIFT-style system, and he's trying to do this with the BRICS club and another economic club that Russia leads. And again, the response was really lukewarm, Francis. There wasn't very much traction at all, and you could feel the idea getting dropped off. Definitely a setback there, I'd say, for Russia and for Putin. The second one, this has been discussed a lot in the Western media. I'm just not 100% sure the story's been reported quite right, because there was a memorandum of understanding signed between China and Russia over the Paris-Siberia 2 gas pipeline, 2,500 kilometer pipeline, which would send gas from Russia to China. In the sort of main Russian media, this has been presented as a success as well. Russia secures making pipeline deal with China, etc. But in the more sort of fringe economic media in Russia, which has a bit more leeway to be independent-minded, there's definitely a tone of disappointment. The Russians came to China to get a deal done, to get a contract signed for this gas pipeline. China is a very important gas client since Europe cut most of its ties with Russia after the invasion of Ukraine in February 22, and China's been looking to export more gas to China. And this pipeline, Paris-Siberia 2, was meant to be the next stage of this process. Putin very much came to Beijing looking to get Xi to sign the dotted line and for this project to get up and running. This did not happen. We know there's still wranglings over how much money China wants to pay for Russian gas, and there's still wranglings about who's going to pay for which sections of this very long pipeline. So again, I think France is definitely disappointment there for the Kremlin.
Well, thank you very much, James, for talking us through. I mean, this is so much. It's such a rich summit with so many different things going on. One of the other things that's been picked up, James, in the media is a hot mic moment between President Xi and Putin. What actually was said between the two?
So, Francis, this hot mic moment was reported a few hours after the parade, the walk to the parade, and it was between Xi and Putin talking about organ transplants and how this was going to extend people's lives and people will be able to live to 150. It was an absolutely bizarre conversation and added to the weird tedium of watching these dictators stroll with global spotlights all over them so that they can watch Xi's toys be played out in front of them. It has to be reminded, Putin and Xi are the same age, they're 72 years old. Putin is obsessed with his health and for living a long time. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he does exercise, he's a good judo practitioner, and he travels around with a personal physician. Even so, despite all the Botox he's been having, and that's very clear, I thought he looked very tired on this trip, actually. The jet lag between Moscow and Beijing is something. I do wonder, Francis, whether it was a real hot mic moment, or it was a setup as well, just to squeeze the Western media into thinking that Xi and Putin have plans to live to 150, i.e. we got them around for another 75 years.
Interesting. I've often thought that we should be counting our blessings that Putin is as old as he is. I mean, Napoleon was 36 at Austerlitz. James, were there any other issues that came out of the summit that you think is worth us talking about?
Yeah, Putin held a 50-minute press conference last night in Beijing on a lawn. The only journalists there were stooge journalists from Russia, and they asked, 20 softball questions, etc. Putin gave his usual answers, nothing particularly unexpected. But he did repeat the line that he was inviting Zelensky to Moscow for peace talks. Of course, this is a setup and a trap. He basically wants Zelensky to go to Moscow to bow and to surrender. That's Putin's ambition. Of course, he knows that Ukraine's going to say, no, we're not going, etc. But the point is, it plays to his own propaganda machine. And they can say that, Putin is the peacemaker. He wants to make peace, but Zelensky won't come to Moscow to talk peace. There was a notable meeting at the SCO summit between Putin and Nicholls, the Prime Minister of Armenia. This is the first time that Putin has met with Pashinyan since Pashinyan and Ilham Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president, signed a peace deal in the Oval Office with Trump last month to end their 4 decade long conflict, which really importantly gives the US control of a transport corridor across Armenia linking Azerbaijani mainland to an exclave, and really sidelined Russia in the South Caucasus. That is the really important point about this peace deal. So Putin was able to talk to Pashinyan. Relations between Pashinyan and Putin are very strained. Pashinyan has said that he wants to pull Armenia into the EU, leave Russia's orbit, etc. Of course, as we know, these are huge red flags for the Kremlin. The Kremlin has said it's going to mount an influence campaign in Armenia to stop this happening. So the fact that they were meeting is definitely worth watching. There was nothing substantial leaked to the press afterwards. They didn't say much to the press afterwards, but an important meeting there. It also highlights the fact that Putin did not meet with Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president. There has been a total collapse in relations between Putin and Aliyev. The biggest about turn in relations you can imagine. Only a year ago, Aliyev was hosting Putin at one of his villas on the Caspian Sea. They were drinking cocktails together. This was the big bromance in the region, etc. Aliyev was due to host a major transport corridor between Russia and India. Aliyev was definitely in Russia's camp. The shooting down of an Azerbaijani airline on Christmas Day and subsequent tit-for-tat recriminations, and this relationship has completely collapsed. Aliyev has come out to support Ukraine now. I mean, the breakdown in relationship between Putin and Aliyev is remarkable and has very large geopolitical ramifications. Aliyev now doing gas deals with Ukraine, talking about Russia being the oppressor. This language, this sort of action was absolutely impossible to imagine a year ago. Putin and Aliyev did not even have a meeting. There's one video shot on a mobile phone where the leaders are getting ready. They're in some sort of green room, so to speak, before they go and walk out ahead of this parade. Putin walks in and Aliyev is hanging around, chatting to someone. And Aliyev and Putin almost bump into each other. And they're forced to have this very terse handshake. And then they just move off with barely saying a word to each other. But that is it. So really interesting, important to monitor geopolitics happening behind the scenes, which has a direct impact on the war in Ukraine.
Well, thanks very much, James. And just before you go, are there any other issues going on at the moment in the wider Russia space that people who are following this war should be aware of, do you think?
There's some war games in Belarus. There's fuel shortages that we keep talking about in Russia. A direct consequence of these drone strikes that Ukraine has been perpetrating on Russian oil refineries have now spread to Luhansk, the occupied part of Donbass region in Ukraine. Plenty of reports now of fuel shortages there. These drone attacks on Russian oil refineries have been a very successful, impactful Ukrainian strategy. There's also an economic forum going on in Vladivostok in Far East Russia at the moment, major 3-day forum. Putin will be speaking there on his way back from China probably tomorrow. But at this forum, a high-ranking official at a Russian bank called PSB, which is linked to the defense sector, gave an interview to Russian journalists where he said that a subsidiary of PSB called A7 has been having a boom year, making financial transactions, cross-border financial transactions on behalf of Russian banks, Russian businesses all around the world, despite US Western sanctions. A remarkable story. He said that A7 has done $95 billion worth of transactions in the first 6 months of the year. Each transaction is, he's talking about small, medium-sized companies, Russian companies trying to do business overseas. He said a typical transaction would be $5,000. We're talking about that sort of level. And he's talking about doing 1,500, 2,000 transactions a day, perhaps showing how porous some of these Western sanctions are on Russia.
Well, thank you very much, James, for your time today. We will be back tomorrow where Dom will be dialing in again. And based on the messages already coming in, I will be grovelling for not having watched Downton Abbey. See you then, everyone. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.